Good afternoon and welcome to today's webcast titled EPA Releases First Ever National Wetland Condition Assessment. This webcast is sponsored by EPA's Watershed Academy and EPA's Office of Wetlands, Oceans and Watersheds, also known as OWOW. I am Ann Weinberg with EPA's Watershed Academy, and I will be co-moderating today's webcast along with Ann Rossi, who is an ORISE Fellow in EPA's Wetlands Division. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll start by going over a few housekeeping items. First, I'd like to briefly summarize the features of today's webcast. We hope that you all will have a lot of questions, and please type your question in the questions box on your control panel and click send. If your control panel is not showing, simply click on the small orange box with the white arrow to expand it. If you have any problems viewing the broadcast, just let us know in the questions box and we will post. This webcast will be archived for later viewing on EPA's Watershed Academy webcast page at www.epa.gov/Watershed Academy. And a PDF copy of the slides is also posted on the Watershed Academy website. Participants are eligible to receive a certificate for their attendance at the end of the webcast, and directions for obtaining the certificate will be presented at the conclusion of the presentations. The materials in this webcast have been reviewed by U.S. EPA staff for technical accuracy. However, the views of the speakers and the speakers' organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. EPA. Mention of commercial enterprises, products, or publications does not mean that U.S. EPA endorses them. So without further ado, let's kick off today's webcast. EPA recently released the National Wetland Condition Assessment, referred to as NWCA, the 2011 report. This report shows that nearly half of the nation's wetlands are in good health, while 20% are in fair health, and the remaining 32% in poor health. During today's webcast, you will hear a brief overview of the National Aquatic Resource Surveys, NARS, that provides information on lakes, rivers, streams, coastal waters, and wetlands. And that will be followed by a presentation on the highlights of the key findings from the National Wetland Condition Assessment Report 2011. So without further delay, let me introduce our highly esteemed speakers. Today you will hear from Sarah Lehman, who is with U.S. Protection Agency's Office of Water. She is the team leader for the National Aquatic Resource Surveys in the monitoring branch. Our next speaker will be Greg Sarenbetz, who is also with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Water. He is an environmental protection specialist with the agency's Wetlands Division. For their full bios, please see the webcast flyer on the Watershed Academy website. Thank you all speakers for joining us today. One final note before we kick off the presentation. We will try to answer as many questions as possible throughout the webcast, and we will pose questions to each speaker after their presentation. If time permits, we'll take any remaining questions at the end. However, due to the high number of participants, not all questions will be answered, so please do contact the speakers after the webcast. The speaker's contact information is on one of the final slides. And so with that, we'll begin our presentation. I will now turn it over to Sarah Lehman to provide an overview of the National Aquatic Resource Surveys, or NARS. The floor is yours. Take it away.
Thanks, Ann. I just wanted to start by saying that Greg and Annie and I are very excited to be here with you all to talk about the National Aquatic Resource Surveys and the National Wetland Condition Assessment in particular. I'm going to be providing some background on the NARS program, including the core approaches we use in each of the surveys that comprise the National Aquatic Resource Surveys, touching on a few of the program's key accomplishments, and then some current and upcoming milestones. In 2004, EPA and our state and tribal partners embarked on a joint effort to assess comprehensively and consistently the quality of the nation's rivers and streams, our lakes, coastal waters, and wetlands. We based the effort on years of scientific research and a number of pilot projects implemented as part of the Office of Research and Development's Environmental Monitoring and Assessment Program. Coming out of that, we developed the National Aquatic Resource Surveys. These surveys cover the 4 water body types on a rotating cycle and are designed to assess surface waters in the conterminous United States. We also do work with Alaska, Hawaii, and the territories through special studies, and you will often see highlights of those studies in the reports that we develop. The survey design, which I'll talk about in a moment, was selected so that the NARS program would be a cost-effective means of providing nationally consistent status and trends information. So as part of the National Aquatic Resource Surveys, we have 3 main objectives that help us address our key gaps that were cited by a variety of independent reviews in the mid-90s and early 2000s. These reviews focused on the ability of EPA and our partners to provide information on the status of water quality in the U.S. in a nationally consistent manner. So our primary objectives are to assess the biological and recreational condition, as well as changes over time of the nation's waters, document associations between indicators of condition and indicators of stress, and also to build and enhance state and tribal monitoring and assessment capacity as a part of the NARS program. Achieving those objectives makes NARS an important part of our collective effort to assess water quality in the United States, from the national to the local scale. We do this in a number of ways, or we can see this coming out of NARS in a number of ways. First, by providing nationally consistent assessments, rather than just rolling up information from state and tribal reports, we're now able to provide this information that's been collected in a nationally consistent way. I want to stop just for a moment to reflect on the accomplishment that we're going to be talking about in greater detail today, the National Wetland Condition Assessment Report. This really is a historic achievement for us and for all of the partners who have been working on this for so many years. First, it's the first national report on the health of the nation's wetlands, which is exciting in and of itself. It also marks the completion of the first full cycle of the National Aquatic Resource Surveys. So we have now completed assessments of rivers and streams, lakes, coastal waters, and wetlands. The National Wetland Condition Assessment Report is a companion to Fish and Wildlife Service's Status and Trends Report, so we have information about not only the quantity of wetlands in the United States and how that's changing, but now also the quality. And so I want to just state my congratulations out to all of the EPA, state and tribal, and other federal agency partners, and many, many other folks who have been working on the National Wetland Condition Assessment since the early research started, pilot projects were implemented, planning and implementation occurred over several years, and then all the work that went into the analysis and report writing and review over the last couple of years. It's really been a big project, and my hats are off to everybody. So the second thing that I want to talk about in terms of the importance of NARS is how it supports national priorities above and beyond providing us with that baseline of information. The information from NARS supports a variety of national priorities. For example, analysis of the NARS data shows that nutrient pollution is widespread, and it's widespread not only across the country but across different water body types. This information supports the continued need to tackle this problem through our water quality programs at the national, state, tribal, and local level. A recent journal article using data from the National Lakes Assessment and the National Rivers and Streams Assessment shows that phosphorus concentrations in our most oligotrophic systems is going up across the country. This was something we hadn't expected to find, and the authors suggest it may be as a result of atmospheric sources rather than more typical point and non-point sources that we think about. So this was a really great example of how having these data across the country helps us look at information in a different way. Another example of applying the NARS data comes from work using the National Lakes Assessment data as well. Scientists examined the relationship between microsystems and land use patterns, as well as some other parameters. The resulting information of that work supported an EPA harmful algal bloom vulnerability assessment that was provided to drinking water utilities as they work to reduce risk associated with HABs. We recognize, however, that NARS alone does not address all water quality questions facing our communities. As part of the overall approach to monitoring that is needed to provide information on water quality, NARS is one component of that, but it is only one component. One way the NARS can help state and tribal and local monitoring efforts is by providing information on the risk of key stressors to biological communities and water quality overall. As an example, Vermont used data from the National Lakes Assessment 2007, which looked at a connection between habitat quality and biological conditions in lakes. Vermont noticed that conditions in Vermont seemed worse than other states in their region as well as nationally, and started working towards understanding that better. A comparison between Vermont and Maine's littoral habitat quality, undertaken along with the second National Lakes Assessment, demonstrated the effectiveness of the shoreline of Maine's shoreline protection measures. And so Vermont began instituting statewide educational effort during the summer of 2013 as they moved forward with their own legislation, which became law on July 1st, 2014. So it's just a great example of how information from the state as well as from the national assessments was used to move forward in protecting water quality. So the NARS approach really focuses on national consistency, and we do a number of things to make sure that all of the data and the assessments that come out of those data are consistent across the country. Each of the surveys applies a similar approach for that. First, we use a randomized design, similar to those used in health surveys or opinion polls where respondents are selected randomly, but the results apply to that larger population. The results of the NARS at the national level are generally reported out at the 95% confidence level, plus or minus about 5%. Each year we sample 1,000 randomly selected sites, and because some states and other partners opt to add additional sites, we often achieve even more than that. We also use standard field and lab protocols at every single site. The same indicators are collected using the same methods by all of the crews, regardless of whether they are in New York or they're in Oregon. This helps us ensure that the resulting data will be comparable across the country. Third, we implement quality assurance and data management at a national level, so everybody is signing on to the same process. This ensures that the data all go through the same QC and that all of the data are stored in a format that is consistent. So when we get to the analysis phase, we aren't having to struggle to bring all that information back together. Our QA doesn't only include review of the data or typical lab QC. We also require that all field crews attend training before the start of the field season, and we conduct assistance visits with each crew as soon as we can, so we can just check to see if there are any problems that need to be corrected. We also work closely with the labs who will be conducting analyses. We go through a verification process to make sure that they have the appropriate certifications or qualifications, and we make sure that they understand all of the things that are required as a part of participation in the NARS program. Finally, once we have the data back from the crews, the labs, and the QC has been conducted, a team of analysts begins conducting nationally consistent assessments. For many indicators, the results are termed regionally relevant because we use a reference approach that takes into account the natural differences one would expect of, say, streams in Minnesota versus those in Arizona. And then our reports are reviewed by partners, EPA management, as well as sent out for independent peer review. So just quickly, I thought I'd also provide you some information on the types of indicators and measures that we include across the National Aquatic Resource Surveys. Obviously, not all of these are included in each water body type, but as I mentioned, if they're included for, say, lakes or for wetlands, they would be at each of those sites. So typical biological indicators include things such as benthic macroinvertebrates. The wetland survey used plants. Rivers and streams also looks at fish communities. Public health or recreational indicators include such things as contaminants in fish tissue, pathogens, and we've begun looking at microcystins and other indicators of algal toxins. We look at the occurrence and extent of key stressors such as high levels of nutrients or excess sediment, and we may also include pertinent research indicators that have come up and that we are collecting across the country. A couple examples here are sediment enzymes that some EPA researchers have been looking at, or contaminants of emergent concern. As of 2015, we've sampled more than 12,000 sites as part of the NARS program, and I point this out mostly just to let you know that we have really large data sets that we would love for other folks to wade into, as it were, with your own analysis, asking your own questions, and working on additional scientific research. In any case, some of our very high-level accomplishments, because Greg is going to be talking about the specific results from the NWCA, include setting baseline conditions across the country for each of the 4 water body types. The NARS reports include assessments of ecological and human health indicators and stressors, and we're starting to report out on changes as we continue to move through the cycle of assessments. The NARS data allow not only for examination of single indicators, however, but because the same core set of data are collected at each site, the program allows for analysis examining associations between indicators. As part of the NARS program, we do this through an analysis called relative risk, and Greg's going to be talking about that in more detail. But the data are there for continued use and for others to look at different ways of connecting the indicators. We continue to work with states, tribes, federal agencies, and others to expand partnerships and to transfer technology back and forth. The NARS have provided a means of introducing new methods, indicators, and analyses to others, and we've learned from all of our partners as well. Some of the current efforts that the team is working on that's focused on transferring more knowledge about how the design itself works and how to appropriately assess the resulting data using the population weight, which is an important component of looking at the population estimates. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but I did want to point out that the NARS has addressed one of the key critiques that came from those mid-1990 and early 2000 studies that were critiquing EPA and our state partners, particularly indicating that we could not report out on the status of all waters. Since the beginning of the NARS program, we have substantially increased the amount of waters assessed across the country. The increases I'm talking about here from 2004 are based on the 2004 305B assessment information from state reports. You can look at the wetlands number alone and see that since 2004, because of the National Wetland Condition Assessment report, we've actually increased the percent of wetlands assessed by 30-fold to greater than 60 million acres of wetlands, which is really amazing. All right, and then just a couple of current and upcoming milestones to give you a feel for where we are in the cycle of the National Aquatic Resource Surveys. We've recently released 3 reports and are looking forward to the release of the second National Lakes Assessment Report very shortly. In 2013 and excuse me, in terms of the next step for data collection and analysis, the rivers and streams assessment that was in the field in 2013 and 2014 is starting the analysis of those data, and we hope to have information to share with state and tribal partners in the fall or early winter. The National Coastal Condition Assessment 2015 finished its field season last fall, and it's completing laboratory processing right now of all the tens of thousands of samples that were received. As I mentioned, the Wetland Survey has crews out in the field collecting data for the next assessment, and the National Lakes Assessment 2017, we've completed the design, the indicators have been selected, and planning for field season is well underway. It's not that long, at least in our way of thinking, before that very first training is going to be started. We just finished wetlands training, but already thinking about that very first National Lakes Assessment training. So with that, I am going to see if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, so much for providing that excellent opening remarks. I think we all have a better understanding of the National Aquatic Resources Surveys now, and the enormity of the data gathering and sampling, and it's very exciting to see the increases in the amount of waters that are assessed across the nation for all the water body types. I also want to join in with you in congratulating the team for completing the first ever National Wetland Condition Assessment. With that, we are now going to take a few questions from the audience, and Rossi will help moderate the questions.
All right, so one of the first questions we have here is, do the reports include geospatial information?
So the reports themselves include maps that will certainly show distribution of sites and that type of information. We have geospatial information related to the ecoregions. We were able to report out nationally as well as by ecoregions. And we haven't always been posting those geospatial mapping components, but the data that are posted with each of the reports do include the latitude and longitude information associated with each individual site. So if there was, if you wanted to see whether there was a site in which sites were in your state or which sites might be near your town, for example, you'd be able to do that.
I think this sort of follows along the same lines. Do the assessments include private and federal lands?
Great question, yes. So we do not limit where the sites can fall. They are randomly selected across the entire lower 48 states, unless you're talking about the special studies that we work on with other, with Alaska, Hawaii, and the territories on. They can be on federal land, private land. They will fall on tribal land, and in that case, the tribes will participate. So it's comprehensive across the country.
Are the national data from EPA ever analyzed with the regional or local data from state and tribal reports?
The way that the National Aquatic Resource Surveys work right now, the primary core reporting that we do only uses data from the National Aquatic Resource Surveys, these probability surveys. We do use some targeted sites that we select as potential reference sites to help in establishing thresholds. But because we are focused so much on making sure that we have nationally consistent data using the same methods and protocols and focused on that random design, we are often unable to incorporate information from other designs that are focused on other questions and objectives, and rightfully so. We've been working with the USGS on looking at different ways that we might be able to use their data from NAQUA with the rivers and streams information from the NARS survey, and we're hoping that that will continue to inform our ability to look at how to combine information from different types of designs.
Okay, we've got a few questions that are sort of about the role of states in the assessment, how they're involved, and who's trained to do this, and who actually carries out the survey.
Yeah, great question, because I didn't go into very much detail about that. So the National Aquatic Resource Surveys are a partnership between EPA, the states, and the tribes. There is a special set-aside in the State Clean Water Act grant program, State and Tribal Grant Program, that provides funding specifically for implementation of the national surveys. When the draw is done to select the 1,000 sites, each state or tribe is provided with funding for the number of sites that fall on their land. So if a tribe had 5 sites, they would get 5 sites worth of funding. If a state had 20 sites, they would get 20 sites worth of funding. The crews, the states and tribes then have the option of conducting the work themselves, or if for some reason they don't feel that they can participate that year, they can request that EPA have contractors conduct the field work or the lab work for them. And so we get a mixture of state crews, tribal crews, contractor crews. In some cases, some EPA crews will go out. We will have other federal agencies who participate as well through different mechanisms. And so all of those folks would be trained. Anybody who's participating as a member of the crew needs to participate in the trainings. We host a Train the Trainer event each year. So this year, Greg, for the National Wetland Condition Assessment, had all the folks who were going to be trainers come together, and we hosted a Train the Trainer event. And then we have regional trainings, usually 9 or 10 trainings across the country, where each of those crews come and learn the methods, have an opportunity to practice the methods. And in fact, because it's so important that everybody do the methods the same way, that's a requirement that they attend.
Would there be a gap in data for regions that are inaccessible?
So we ask the crews to make every effort to get to any site, and it is absolutely true that some of our sites are located in very difficult to get to locations. We have some sites that are just off of a highway and take 15 minutes to get to. We have other sites that are located in mountainous areas that can require hikes in and out of. Whenever possible, we ask the crews to get to those sites. There are obviously sites that do get dropped, and so there are some sites where the location was so far that our funding just wouldn't stretch to address it. There are some sites that are too dangerous to go into, and there are some sites that the landowner denies access for. And so those are portions of the resource that we do not have assessed. And you'll see in the report some discussion of the extent of the resource for wetlands that we could assess and the extent of the resource that we could not assess because of things like that. Great question.
Do the reports show any impacts of climate change?
Right now, we have not done a lot of work with using our indicators to analyze for climate change. Part of that is we've been focused on sort of the core assessment of biological condition and stressors. Part of it is we're still working with different researchers to determine what types of information would be most useful for looking at climate change. But it is a conversation we expect to have and over time, and either to reanalyze the data we've already collected to look at issues related to climate change if we can, or to talk with folks about considerations for additional indicators that we might want to add.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Those were some really good questions and some really good answers, so thank you. I'd now like to introduce Greg Sarenbeds, who will present the results of the National Wetlands Condition Assessment, or the NWCA. Greg, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Anne. Thanks, Sarah, for providing that overview of NARS. I'm also very excited to be here today and to talk to you all about the National Wetland Condition Assessment. Just an overview of the slides and my presentation today. I'm going to talk a little bit about just provide a brief overview of the National Wetland Condition Assessment, talk a little bit about the background and objectives for the survey, go through all the things that we did to plan, design, and then implement the survey in the field. And then the next section, I'm going to go over the findings from the Wetland Condition Assessment 2011 survey at both the national scale and also regional scale by wetland type. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the implications of NWCA 2011 and discuss a little bit about what we're thinking about for future directions, both looking at applications of the 2011 data and then also providing you with information on the next cycle of the survey, which is taking place right now. We've actually got a number of field crews sampling sites across the country. So the first thing I wanted to do is really emphasize and acknowledge the significant contributions that were made by a number of different organizations. Quite simply, the survey could not have been possible without the significant contributions of all of the partners that I list here. From state and tribal partners who conducted sampling in the field. We had over 50 crews that sampled sites in 2011. Most were members of state agencies, but we also had EPA crews, contractor crews, and also a couple of tribal crews that went out and sampled sites with us. We also benefited from the contributions of numerous federal partners, and a few that I want to highlight really because, again, their role in the survey was really critical. Fish and Wildlife Service provided us with guidance and access to the status and trends, design and mapping data. The NRCS Soil Survey helped provide guidance and helped develop our soil protocols. They trained crews in the field at the regional trainings that Sarah just spoke about. They QA'd our soil characterization data, and then the NRCS lab in Lincoln, Nebraska processed all of the soil sample data. The U.S. Geological Survey provided guidance on algae analysis. We worked with the USDA plants team on taxonomic reconciliation of our plant names, so basically making sure that all of the plants that were identified in NWCA could be reconciled and connected to the USDA plant nomenclature. The National Park Service, which actually sampled a number of sites for us, both in Acadia National Park and then in their Great Lakes Network. This augmented the number of sites that we could look at as potential reference sites. And then finally, U.S. Forest Service, Army Corps of Engineers, and NOAA all provided advice and guidance throughout the planning and implementation phases. Also suggestions for reference sites and others. So each of these federal partners really, again, provided outstanding support to us, and I want to recognize them. We also had a number of academic institutions that were involved, helped with the protocol design, analysis of data, and then lastly, really, we couldn't have done this without the significant contributions of our sister Office of Research and Development and then the EPA regional offices, who from day one really helped to plan and implement and assess the data. So, objectives of the NWCA. These are similar to the overall objectives of other NARS that Sarah talked about earlier. For NWCA specifically, it's to produce a national report describing the ecologic condition of the nation's wetlands and stressors most commonly associated with poor condition, to do so at national scales and, if, when appropriate and possible, at regional scales as well. To collaborate with states and tribes in developing complementary wetland monitoring tools, analytic approaches, and technologies for data management. We are very pleased with the level of engagement and involvement of our state partners. A number of states also implemented intensification studies alongside the NWCA, and so they are able to actually conduct state-specific studies in conjunction with the national study. And then lastly, all of these, the efforts to produce a national report and the collaboration with states and tribes developing wetland monitoring and assessment techniques really did advance the science of wetland monitoring and assessment that we hope will support wetland management and policy needs as we move forward. And really the overarching goal with all of these objectives is information on wetland quality that leads to more effective protection and restoration of wetlands across the country. So activities to plan and implement NWCA began in earnest in 2006 and involved a collaborative stakeholder-driven process. We engaged with multiple stakeholders during this period, from states and tribes, other federal agency partners, experts in wetland science and assessment, to develop and test all of the facets of the survey. So this included research into and selection of appropriate indicators of condition, survey design, including definition and identification of our target wetland population, protocol development and field-based testing. A number of summers, crews from EPA and states helped us to pilot test the field methods. And then the last stage really in planning was the development of manuals, forms, and the databases that would house the considerable amount of data collected when we were out in the field sampling in 2011. And then finally in 2011 we did make it to the field. We trained field crews and then implemented the survey in the field. So this slide is just provides a summary of the major components of NWCA field data collection and analysis activities. Really started with selecting and sampling sites representing the population of wetlands across the country. And for each of these components, I'm going to talk a little bit more in the slides that are coming up. The next step or component was collecting standardized field and lab data. So as Sarah indicated, we do put forth considerable effort to make sure that all of the protocols are implemented consistently across all of the different crews that are participating in the survey, and same thing with the labs. For a number of indicators, we had multiple labs processing that data, and we really make sure that we can assess the information and rely on it, the consistency and the data acquisition. Then we develop appropriate metrics, indicators of condition and stress, set thresholds for condition stress categories. These are basically, if you have read the report or other NARS reports, the kind of good, fair, poor categories, or In the case of stressors, high, moderate, or low. And then lastly, we derive estimates of condition stress for the population, and then create these wonderful graphics with the green, yellow, and red bars for all the different indicators at both national and regional scales. So to say a little bit more about the selection of sites for NWCA, sites were selected using a probability-based survey design called, well, the acronym is GRITS. It stands for General Random Tessellation Survey, I believe. But everyone just calls it GRITS. But the real, the strength of this type of design is that every element in the population has a known probability of selection. This ensures that the results reflect the full range of wetlands in the target population. We utilized the Fish and Wildlife Service Status and Trends Sample Frame as a base map to select wetland sites meeting the NWCA target population of wetlands. And all sites were screened to ensure that they met established criteria for inclusion in survey. And I want to iterate the NWCA target population for the survey. This included tidal and non-tidal wetlands of the conterminous U.S., including certain farmed wetlands not currently in crop production. The wetlands have rooted vegetation and, when present, open water less than 1 meter deep. I want to emphasize or state that we use a definition for wetlands that's described by Corden that is broader than the definition used in the Clean Water Act. And thus, the wetlands jurisdictional status under state or federal regulatory programs did not factor into our definition of target. And then last, in addition to the selection of probability sites, we also selected and sampled a number of hand-picked sites thought to be in reference condition. These are used to augment the potential pool of sampled sites in reference condition used in analysis of the data. So here is a map showing the location of the sites ultimately sampled in 2011 and the broad ecoregions that EPA used to report data at regional scales. So there were 4 broad ecoregions that we used. The distribution of sites reflects the distribution of wetland area across the U.S. So you certainly note that sites are clustered in certain areas of the country, and these are areas where wetlands are more prevalent. It also reflects the intensification studies that I talked about, where a few states added sites within the state to augment and be able to report on the state wetlands within that state separately. And so North Dakota, Wisconsin, and Idaho all sampled additional sites, and so some of the distribution of sites in those areas also was higher than the other country because of those intensification studies. Overall, 1,179 sites were sampled, including 41 sites on the North Slope coastal plain of Alaska. So we worked with the state of Alaska on a sampling design that included sites up there on the North Slope. The nice thing about that is that they actually used all of our protocols so that those sites were also sampled with the same, using the same methods as all of the lower 48. They're not included in the final report, and primarily because the sites are just such a different ecosystem than those in the lower 48 that wasn't really possible to combine that data. The next series of slides depicts a typical site layout and the types of data collected for NWCA. And types of data collected were chosen because they provide relevant info on biological, chemical, and physical features of the site that could be used to evaluate the ecological condition or stress. They were broadly applicable across different regions and types and logistically feasible to collect. Each of these sites is generally sampled in the course of 1 day, sometimes the course of 2 days, but in any way, there are some types of data that we could not collect because of the limited amount of time that we were at the site and that we were also at that site just once, except for a number of sites that are sampled twice for data analysis purposes. So at each site, crews collected data within a core assessment area. This is represented by a 40-meter radius circle around the sampling point. That represents a 0.5 hectare area. Then we also sampled in the surrounding buffer, and this is a 100-meter area outside the core assessment area. And one thing I want to note here is that we did not assess entire wetlands. It was restricted to this half-hectare area, the core assessment area, and then the 100-meter buffer surrounding that. That buffer could, for purposes of NWCA, include both wetland buffer or upland buffer. So within the assessment area, crews collected data on vegetation, species identity, presence, and abundance within 5 100-meter square plots. You can see those are represented by the 5 green plots, so each of those is 10 by 10 meters. And they are arrayed in a systematic way around the point. And the point's represented by the red dot. We also collected data on soils and looked at soil morphology, color, texture, saturation. We also took samples for analysis of physical and chemical properties. 4 soil pits were described, and these are represented by the yellow X's. And then at one soil pit that was seen to be the representative or most representative of soil at that site, we collected soil samples down to 125 centimeters. We also collected data on hydrology. This is presence of water sources, evidence of hydrologic alterations, and indicators of hydrology. Water chemistry, sample collected at sites with surface water greater than 15 centimeters deep. This was analyzed for a certain number of water quality parameters, nutrients, pH, conductivity, and a few others. And then we also collected a sample to do algae analysis. So we looked at both the species composition and also collected a water sample and samples from epiphytes to analyze for both chlorophyll A and microcystin. Again, that was only at sites where water was greater than 15 centimeters deep. Then within the buffer, crews collected data on natural cover, so vegetation and ground cover in 1,200-meter square plots arrayed along the cardinal directions from the point. So on this picture, you can see those blue box, lightly colored blue boxes. Those were where we collected data on the buffer, and again, it included natural cover, disturbance, the presence of stressors, again in those 1,200-meter square plots. And then we also did an assessment of the presence of 22 targeted invasive plant species. And then lastly, also in this 100-meter area surrounding the assessment area, we collected data for a pilot rapid assessment method that we called USA-RAM. The components of USA-RAM looked at physical and biological structure within the assessment area, presence of stressors within the AA, and also presence of stressors within the buffer. All right. So once field collection activities were completed, we then had to develop appropriate metrics and indicators of condition and stress. I've highlighted a couple components here that I'll discuss briefly today, but want to really emphasize that more specific and detailed information is provided in the NWCA 2011 technical report. Information on how and where to access that will be provided later on a later slide. But I did want to mention that there was a considerable amount of time and effort to process and QA all the field and lab data. We also spent some time looking at and determining the appropriate reporting groups and also characterizing reference condition. In terms of the reporting groups, general rule followed by EPA and the NARS surveys is to have greater than 50 sites per reporting group to achieve statistically valid estimates. For NWCA, we the diversity of wetlands across the country and within different ecoregions. And one of the maps I have showing on this slide are the our 9 ecoregions that have been typically used in the rivers, streams, and lakes assessment. And our goal going into NWCA was to be able to try to report, if we could, on those 9 ecoregions, but really the variety of wetlands type within ecoregion and the need to get to 50 sites to really have to achieve statistically valid estimates meant that we had to combine both ecoregions, and also we needed to group wetland types. And so the way that we did this for NWCA was to take these 9 NARS ecoregions, and these are based on Level 3 Omernac ecoregions. So we 9 into 4 that were used for NWCA. And the 4 are the ecoregion for the west, ecoregion that combined all of the plains ecoregions, ecoregion that combined the northern Appalachian, southern Appalachian mountains, and the Midwest region into an eastern mountain and upper Midwest ecoregion. And then our other ecoregion, the coastal plain, actually we were able to keep that ecoregion as its own reporting group because we had so many sites within that ecoregion. So in terms of the wetland types, we also, again, combined those, and all of our wetlands were categorized based on the Corridon classification system, and so that we combined emergent, pond, and farmed categories into an herbaceous wetlands category, and then we also combined scrub, shrub, and forested into a woody category. And then these are the 10 overall, or the 10 reporting groups that we developed and determined for NWCA. And really the key here on this graphic is to note that essentially for each of those 4 ecoregions, we have an inland herbaceous and inland woody category. So that's the 8 reporting categories there. And then for the estuarine category, we actually reported on those nationally. So we had an estuarine herbaceous and an estuarine woody reporting group. Another component in developing the metrics and indicators of condition or stress is characterizing reference condition, which NWCA defined as least disturbed. We used an approach similar to well-established ones that have been used in the studies. For NWCA, 4 categories of stressor data were used from field or lab data to categorize sites as least disturbed. We looked at the buffer data that we collected, hydrology, soil chemistry, and non-native plant cover. So basically looking at those stressor checklists that crews observed in the field, we screened out sites into least disturbed and most disturbed categories. So each site was screened to see if it exceeded a certain threshold or not based on those 4 categories of stressor data. And the thresholds themselves could be observed presence, chemical concentration based on literature and lab data, or through best professional judgment in the case of the non-native plant cover. And for basically the goal of the screening was to identify least or most disturbed for each reporting group. And there was a target goal of identifying 20 to 30% of sites per class target, so per reporting group. And then basically the rest of the sites fall into this intermediate category. So the map here just depicts sites classified in each of those categories, least disturbed, intermediate disturbed, and most disturbed across the United States. And the other thing I wanted to note here is that the pool of candidates included all sites sampled. So when we do the characterization of reference condition, it's not just those hand-picked sites that we targeted early as potential reference. Those aren't the only ones that we use in this screen. We actually look at every single site that's sampled to create the list or the pool of sites that is in each of those different disturbance classes. So once appropriate metrics, indicators of condition stress are developed, we then set the condition stressor threshold. So this is where we basically are now setting the thresholds between the different categories that we've established for our indicators of condition or stress. So in the case of indicators of condition, this is good, fair, poor. In the case of indicators of stress, in NWCA we used high, moderate, or low. And so there's two real ways that you set condition or stressor thresholds. One is using a distribution-based threshold approach. This is something that's been used across NARS and the different NARS surveys. And in a distribution-based approach, you look at the range and values found in the set of sites considered to be least disturbed. That in the graphic on the right, the bar graph, this is an example for the vegetation multimetric index. And basically that bar graph represents the sites that were considered to be least disturbed. You look at the range of values and you set the threshold between good and fair at the 25th percentile and between fair and poor at the 5th percentile. So you basically look at the VMMI score at those percentile levels, and that's your threshold. For NWCA, we did that for the vegetation MMI, so our condition indicator. We also did that for one of our stressor indicators, the soil phosphorus. In the case of stressors, the percentiles change, and you actually are looking at the 75th percentile as the difference between good and fair, and then the 95th percentile is the difference between fair and poor. So the other approach to setting condition stressor thresholds used in NWCA is a fixed-based approach. And this is where you use accepted values from peer-reviewed, published literature that are widely, well-established or widely used by agencies. And an example of this is the threshold we use for microcystin, which is based on World Health Organization values of recreational exposure. And then lastly, we also rely on best judgment, and an example of this is the non-native plant stressor. So this is a list of the 2011 indicators used in NWCA. As I mentioned, our biological condition indicator is the vegetation multimetric index. This is an index comprised of 4 metrics related to plant abundance, native status, and tolerance to disturbance. We had 2 stress indicators based on physical stress of vegetation alteration, so vegetation removal and vegetation replacement. These were both based on field observations related to either the loss, removal, or damage of vegetation, or a change in plant species present due to anthropogenic activities. And that was one of the, vegetation replacement used that description. We had 4 indicators of physical stress based on hydrologic alteration. These are damming, ditching, hardening, and filling erosion. Just wanted to say a little bit more about hardening. The others are pretty self-evident. Hardening related to any field observation that was an activity related to soil compaction, so example, roads, suburban residential development, or pavement. And then we also identified 3 indicators of chemical stress. A heavy metal index comprised of 12 different heavy metals associated with anthropogenic activities measured in the soil samples, soil phosphorus, which is a concentration of phosphorus in the soil sample, and microcystin, which is a concentration of the algal toxin microcystin in a water sample. And then lastly, we had an indicator of biological stress, which was a non-native plant stressor index. And this index is comprised of 3 metrics related to the presence and abundance of non-native plants. So lastly, we've established our indicators or metrics of condition and stress, and we've identified the thresholds for each of the categories. So we now basically take each NWCA probability site and assign it to a condition or stress level category based on the indicator value. for the site and the threshold appropriate to the site. We do this for both biologic condition, and as I mentioned, we use good, fair, poor category ratings for that, and then for levels of stress, which were high, moderate, or low. And then we take the site weights from the probability design, and these reflect the number of acres each site represents across the total population of the specified NWCA target wetland type, and then these are summed for each class to come up with the estimate of the total wetland area in that class. So I'm going to stop right now, take questions on the essentially what NWCA did to get to the to collect and analyze the data.
Okay, thank you, Greg, very much for that excellent summary of the design of the National Wetland Condition Assessment. We're now going to stop for a moment and take a few questions from the audience that Annie Rossi will go through before we go on to the findings of the NWCA.
Right. The first question is about the ecoregions, kind of if you could define them and how they were drawn up.
Yeah. So so each of the ecoregions, again, those are based on OMERNEC Level 3 ecoregions that EPA has used in other ecological assessments. And I believe they look at physical, climate, other geology variables to basically categorize and combine different ecoregions. So we started with the 9, with those combined 9 that were used in other aquatic resource surveys, and then combined the regions based on sort of, again, climate, climate, geology, other similar characteristics between those ecoregions. We did some analysis to ensure that those were appropriate reporting groups to use, and the results of that analysis is actually described in the technical report. So if you did want to know any more information than that, I really encourage you to look at the technical report. It'll talk more about how we and the appropriateness of combining the ecoregions the way that we did.
Okay. The next question, is the sampling area limited to wetland?
So the core assessment area, within the core assessment area, and that's the half-hectare area where we collected most of the data, that could have up to 10% upland or non-sampleable area, we called it, within it. But generally the assessment areas were all wetland, and the buffer area could be wetland or could be upland.
And was data collected in seasonally saturated wetlands or only in inundated wetlands, or how did season impact the study?
That's a great question, and we know that yes, the wetlands can be dependent on seasonal fluctuations of water and inundation. We use the Corden, the definition used by Corden and under the Corden classification system to define wetlands at the moment when we were sampling. So Cruz did an assessment of that, and if it met the Corden, the definition under the Corden classification system for wetland, then it was sampled, included in our population. And so, and just so that we could have seasonally saturated wetlands within our population.
There's a couple of questions about the maps that you've shown, showing the distribution of points. The first one was if that included the randomly selected sites as well as the hand-picked sites.
Yes, that map, and I'll go back to it. That probably will help. There. So this map includes all sites, so both the probability sites and then also the hand-picked sites.
And then also, why is the western coast so underrepresented in terms of sampling points?
Yes, that is also, that's a great question. We actually initially the status and trend sample frame that we utilized had very few plots spread out across the West Coast. We actually worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service to add status and trend plots to the West Coast so that we would pick up more sites in that area. As you'll note from the map, we actually did not collect that many, or we did not sample all that many additional sites across the West. Although the map is a little bit, the spatial distribution of sites across the West Coast does look pretty sparse, but we actually sampled probably 30 or 40 sites within the San Francisco Bay Area. And on the map, you can't really see that because the sites are all on top of each other. But there were across the entire West Coast more sites sampled that are that really show up on this map.
I think this next question sort of applies to all the NARS surveys, not just wetlands. But what's the scale that data from the reports can be used? The appropriateness of
right.
Scale.
So. Again, we feel that that at both national and the regional levels that we report on, that is the appropriate scale for this data. We're looking at ways of looking at the data and having and applying the data at different scales, but at least for the type of population estimates that we assess and report on, national and regional are the most appropriate.
And I think we have time for one more question. Okay. The setting the thresholds for good, fair, poor values, are they the same for all sites, or how are those set?
No. So those. So in the case of and I think let me know if I'm not totally getting the question, but I think the question is, are they the same across the country for all reporting groups, or do they vary? And the answer is that it depends on the indicator. For the Vegetation Multimetric Index, we actually did develop thresholds that were regionally specific. So each of those, so the VMMI threshold for each of the ecoregions was different. For the soil phosphorus indicator, we actually did use the same threshold across the entire country.
And then I think the clarification they also wanted is if the values are relative to what's found within that region. So if all stressors are very low at all the sites in the region, then the highest of those lows becomes the high, correct?
Correct.
Okay, well, thank you for Annie and Greg for that question and answer session. I'll just fill the airspace a little bit while you get to your slides that you're trying to get to, where you're going to present the findings of the National Wetland Condition Assessment. So here we go.
All right. So the next, section of today's talk is going to be to go through the 2011 findings. The results from data analysis presented in the 2011 report are presented both nationally and regionally by major ecoregion and broad wetland type. Estimates for different reporting groups are provided by the condition and stress category. I have an example on the next slide, and I did want to just mention that both of the 2011 public report and technical report went through several partner, formal peer, and EPA management reviews, as well as a public comment before becoming final. We did release the final report on May 11th of this year. And so what I wanted to do first off is that the results for each of the indicators of condition stress at both national levels and for each reporting group are presented in a standard way throughout the report. I'm going to walk through a figure for using the Vegetation Multimetric Index. Again, that's our indicator of biologic condition on this slide. But for the rest of the presentation, we'll just be providing general summaries of our results nationally and for each of the ecoregions. And but I do really want to encourage everyone to take a look at the report for more detailed results for all of the reporting groups. So again, here's kind of a standard chart, that bar graph that we use to depict the results for each of the indicators across the the 4 major ecoregions and also at the national scale. The example here, again, is of the Vegetation Multimetric Index. And at least at the national level, we provide national estimates of condition or stress, and these are shown by the first group of bars, followed by estimates for each of the NWCA aggregated ecoregions. Condition classes or stress levels are indicated by the colors. Green, condition or low stress. Yellow is fair condition or moderate stress. Red is poor condition or high stress. And then in the case of the non-native plant stressor index, we actually have a very high stress category, and this is dark red. And then lastly, we have a gray, and this is where we could not assess a part of the population because of missing data or samples, that kind of issue. So the number shows, the number that's next to the bar graph shows the value of the estimate represented by the bar. In this instance, 48% of wetland area nationally is in good condition. I do want to emphasize, even though that in the rest of the slides I'll be reporting one number, all of the results for NWCA and all the NARS surveys are actually ranges of results. So really the true value or in the analysis is a range of 48% plus or minus X percent. And so just wanted to highlight that really, and you can see the error bars. I'm going to talk about those in a second. Oh, right here. So all right, so then the confidence interval displays the level of certainty or confidence in the estimate. So again, our results really are presented as a range, and the size of the confidence interval, or this bar, displays our level of certainty or confidence in the estimate. So the tighter the bar, the shorter that bar is, the more confident we are in the value of that estimate. So and then on the left hand side of this chart, we are talking about the proportion of wetland area nationally or within an ecoregion in each of the condition or stress level categories. So again, this is reporting area. And then on the right side, we talk about assessed wetland area in acres, nationally or within an ecoregion in each of the condition or stress level categories. And the highlight here really is, and you can see this come up quite clearly in looking at the West. The West has 61% of wetland area that's in poor condition, but it really doesn't have much of an impact on the national estimate. And the reason why is that the area itself of wetland in poor condition across the West is very low. Wetland area across the West comprises a very small percentage of overall wetland area across the country. All right. So now I'm going to, as I mentioned, kind of go through some of the key NWCA findings, both at the national level and regional level. At least nationally, less than half of wetland area, 48%, is in good condition based on plant community characteristics. Physical disturbances to wetlands and surrounding habitat, such as soil compaction, ditching, and plant removal, are the most widespread stressors. And looking at sort of relative risk and extent of wetland area with high stress levels, wetlands with high levels of stress from soil compaction are twice as likely to have plant communities in poor condition. So this is, I'll talk a little bit more about the sort of looking at relative risk of the data set. But in this particular case, we feel that this is sort of one of those important highlights, and one thing that we found is that, and it's certainly not a surprise, but obviously the compaction of soil is having an impact on and does contribute to poor condition. And then non-native plants are a problem, particularly in the interior plains and west. And then generally we found that the West is in poor condition and has higher levels of stress than other regions. So looking at the national findings specifically for biological indicators, both the indicator of condition and the indicator of stress, And want to see a little bit more about our indicator of condition. We did, this is based on a vegetation multi-metric index that was developed specifically for NWCA. And this is based on field-based observances of plant species presence and abundance, and then also species trait information. So the C of C values, so conservatism values reflecting sensitivity to human disturbance, non-native plant status, that's the type of trait information that was also brought into the index to assess condition. I mentioned that we used a reference-based approach to set regionally specific thresholds, and we found that 48% of wetland area is in good condition, 20% in fair, and 32% in poor. In terms of the indicator of stress for biology, or biologically, we did develop a non-native plant stressor index based on species composition and traits. This used a fixed threshold nationally, and we found that 19% of wetland area is high or very high levels of stress from non-native plants. So on to physical indicators of stress. These are based on field observed disturbances to wetlands and their surrounding habitat. Disturbances were classified by whether they resulted primarily in alterations to vegetation. An example of this is either removal or replacement. And if you look at the picture of removal, this just shows probably better than I described earlier what we mean by removal. This was the loss removal of vegetation due to logging, grazing, any type of activity that did result in removal of vegetation material. And then in terms of replacement, what we mean there, and you've got an example and slide, is really the change in vegetation from a natural wetland community to some type of non-natural. So crops or fallow fields or golf course, lawns, parks. That was an example of vegetation replacement. Hydrology, there were 4 disturbances categorized: damming, ditching, hardening, and filling erosion. And again, hardening was either directly paved or impervious surfaces, or activities related to soil compaction, so animal or human trampling, off-road vehicle use, trails, that type of thing. Fixed thresholds were used nationally for these indicators, and hardening, plant removal were found at high stress levels for 27% of wetland area, and ditching is at high stress levels for 23%. So those were our 3 top stressors based on physical alterations. In terms of the chemical indicators of stress, these are based on laboratory analysis of soil and water samples collected at each field site. For soil indicators, again, we looked at a heavy metal index. This is concentrations of 12 metals compared to literature values for background and natural for background levels, and then we also looked at natural breaks in the NWCA data set itself. In terms of heavy metal, we really didn't find a lot that were at high stress levels nationally. Just 2% of wetland area was estimated to be at high stress levels for this indicator. Soil phosphorus, we looked at concentrations compared to reference-based thresholds, and for this indicator we found that 6% of wetland area nationally is at high stress levels. We also looked at microcystin, and this is a toxin produced by cyanobacteria. It was detected in 12% of wetland area nationally, but less than 1% were at levels that were at moderate or high levels of risk for recreational exposure when compared to the HU threshold. So we did detect it across the country, but not at levels that suggest risk to human health. So this is just a slide talking a little bit about, and this is the where we look at relative extent of high stressor levels, relative risk, and attributable risk. And what this is really doing is providing some information, quantitative information on the relationships between the stressor and condition data. So what we do is we basically look at the indicators of stress, the physical and chemical ones, and then we compare that to the biological indicator of condition. And that tells us or provides us with some information that policymakers and managers can use to potentially develop programs or mitigation strategies to reduce risk and improve biologic condition. So for relative risk, this is a measure of the likelihood that a site has poor biological condition when the magnitude of the stressor is high relative to when it is low. So looking at this middle series of bar charts, you can see that for vegetation removal, we have a relative risk ratio of 1.9. What essentially that's saying is that sites that have high stress, that are in that high stress category, are nearly twice as likely to be in poor condition looking at the biological indicator. So you'll note that for all of these stressors, we have pretty wide confidence levels. So they're really all within a certain range, but it does suggest that each of these indicators, at least the physical indicators of stress, all are having an impact and do affect condition and are leading to or suggest that sites with those stress are in poorer condition than sites without that stress. All right. So next, I want to go through a series of slides. These are focused on the regional results. And as I mentioned earlier, findings for the West are worse. We found that they were worse than other ecoregions. 61% of wetland area is in poor condition versus only 21% found to be in good condition. There are greater percentage of wetland area at high levels of stress for a number of the indicators of stress. So ditching was found to be 76%, non-native plants at high or very high levels is at 72%, hardening at 70%, and vegetation removal at 61%. Also for the West, we did find that heavy metals were at moderate stressor levels for 47% of wetland area. So in terms of the interior plains, 44% of wetland area is in good condition versus 19% in poor condition. Things looking a little better in the interior plains, although interestingly, they do have, while not as high levels as the West, there were some physical stressors that were found to be pretty high or found at high levels in this ecoregion. All physical stressors, as a matter of fact, were found above 20% except for filling erosion. So, so these systems are and do have a lot of stress, but that didn't necessarily lead to poor condition looking at the vegetation multimetric index. We also, non-native plants at high or very high stressor levels for 46% of the wetland area. And I thought this was interesting in that only 4% of the inland herbaceous wetland area for this ecoregion was at low stressor levels. So essentially that means that almost all of this wetland area in the interior plains is impacted in some way by non-native plants. So moving on to the coastal plains, and just one highlight here is that half of assessed wetland area nationally occurs in this ecoregion. That is one reason why we were able to present results for this ecoregion separately. We didn't need to combine it with any other ecoregions. It does also closely mirror the national findings because it does comprise essentially half of wetland area. 50% of wetland area is in good condition in this ecoregion versus 29% in poor condition. Vegetation removal, hardening, and ditching were the predominant stressors at high levels. And then one interesting thing with this ecoregion, which really we didn't see in the other ecoregions, is that inland herbaceous wetlands are far worse than inland woody wetlands. So when looking at the different stressors and also at the biological condition indicator, inland herbaceous we're not doing so well. So 59% of wetland area is found to be in poor condition. Vegetation removal was at 61%, hardening at 57%, and ditching at 52%. And then last ecoregion, the Eastern Mountains and Upper Midwest. 52% of wetland area in good condition versus 37% in poor condition. Hardening, vegetation removal, and ditching were predominant stressors at high levels. In this ecoregion, a larger percentage of wetland area was found to have high stress levels for soil phosphorus, and this was by far more than the other ecoregions. And in particular for the inland herbaceous reporting group, 35% of wetland area was at high stress levels for soil phosphorus. And then heavy metals were at moderate stressor levels for 31% of wetland area across this ecoregion. So we also looked at estuarine wetlands we separated them out into two wetland types, but we looked at estuarine wetlands across the whole country. So we didn't look at them ecoregionally. The results for estuarine wetlands are grouped together irregardless of the ecoregion that they fall within, but we did separate them out by wetland type, so either herbaceous or woody. The estuarine herbaceous wetland area is 90% of the total, so they far outnumber the woody wetlands in this category, as a percentage of estuarine wetlands overall. Estuarine herbaceous wetlands, 58% of wetland area was found to be in good condition, 26% in poor. Ditching, hardening, and damming were the predominant stressors at high levels. Non-native plants were at high and very high levels for 24% of wetland area. Looking just at the woody wetlands, 59% of wetland area in good condition versus 22% in poor, and ditching, hardening, and soil phosphorus were the predominant stressors at high levels. So again, I really encourage everyone to look at the report. There is much more specific and detailed information for each of the different reporting groups, more information on the indicators. We have a public report, and then also the technical appendix to report that essentially documents and details all of the analysis that went into the results presented in the report. So again, if you're interested in finding more information about how we did things, I do strongly encourage you to look at these reports. We also have all of our data sets up, and both the reports and our data sets are available at the website that I've linked to here. You can also just Google National Wetland Condition Assessment. This will pull it up. One thing that I wanted to just caveat is that we are going to be revising or uploading data sets in the next week or two. We're actually changing the naming conventions and structure that we're using for these data sets. So we are going to be uploading new data sets very shortly, but the data itself will not be different, and so but it's worth it to check back, and actually for all of the NARS surveys, to check back periodically on our data page and make sure that if you are analyzing the data, you're using the most current data sets. So lastly, I did want to just talk a little bit about implications and follow-up actions that we have been undertaking here at EPA and in consultation with our partners and other collaborators. We are working to further understand data results for the West ecoregion. We actually changed the survey design so that we added more sites across the West and will enable reporting of both the xeric and Western Mountains ecoregions independently. So if you look at the map that I've got on this slide, whereas for NWCA 2011, the entire part of the West from really the Rocky Mountains on was one reporting group. In 2016, it will be 2 reporting groups, one for the mountain regions and one for the xeric ecoregions. We're also targeting additional candidate reference sites, so sampling more of these hand-picked sites that we hope will help us to characterize condition, least disturbed condition across the West, and really in both of those ecoregions. And there has been some work in really our EPA's Region 10 office, which is in Seattle, and EPA's Office of Research and Development in Corvallis, Oregon, which really is our technical experts on these surveys. They're based in the Pacific Northwest, so there's a lot of interest from both of those offices in trying to investigate and explore what's going on across the West. Also, our Region 9 office in San Francisco. And so there was a panel session at the Society of Wetland Science Pacific Northwest workshop last year to explore the data across the West and look at ways of investigating and certainly with the new design changes to NWCA 2016 to be able to really explore why the results might be the way they are across the West. We've also been engaged with stakeholders on just general and overall implications, applications, and uses of the NWCA data. There's going to be a special issue on NWCA in a scientific journal very soon. Dr. Mary Cantula is putting that together, and we'll have 15 additional articles, each on different components of our data analysis in NWCA. And I will include, basically we'll include some components that were not included in the public report. But I really do encourage folks to be on the lookout for this set of scientific articles, which we overall also believe will really add to wetland science of monitoring and assessment. We also, as Sarah mentioned, we've got 12,000 sites worth of data now out there, and we've really been trying hard to come up with ways to encourage everyone to use that data and explore it. And one of the ways that we're doing this is through what we're calling a campus challenge. And we're actually actively looking for research proposals from graduate students to provide research proposals on using the NWCA data for different types of analysis that we didn't conduct in the report so thus far. And then finally, we're working with the Association of State Wetland Managers on ways to help states and tribes communicate the results of the NWCA. So look at it. Obviously, the primary reporting is at this national and regional level. And ASWM is working with states on meaningful ways to communicate those national and regional results in ways that states and tribal entities can use for their own program, or to highlight what they themselves are doing at the state and tribal level in terms of wetland monitoring and assessment and overall wetland management and restoration. So other applications and uses of NWCA data we have been exploring, and again, this is not something that we want to just have all the data that we collected have sit on a shelf or just really be this one report that we just released. We really want to figure out how to make use of this data in different to manage and come up with effective wetland program policies and management actions. So we have been talking and working with compensatory mitigation and voluntary restoration folks to see how our data might be useful in those contexts. Just offhand, I can think that we've categorized and have really gradients of condition for 1,000 sites across the country in all different ecoregions and by wetland types. And we have categorized these into least disturbed and most disturbed gradients. And so that certainly is, or the least disturbed sites could be used as reference sites in designing compensatory mitigation or voluntary restoration. We have documented protocols for assessing vegetation and soil and stressors, hydrology, and water chemistry. So our field methods and protocols, can those be used to help inform or look at the performance of compensatory mitigation projects and voluntary restoration projects as well. What are wetlands' role in mitigating climate change? We have been involved in a project at EPA to look at carbon stocks within, or basically our soil data, and use that to help estimate carbon stocks within wetlands for different wetland types and across the country. So again, this is where our data itself is being used to inform possible carbon sequestration abilities and other connections to wetlands' role, again, in either providing mitigation towards climate change, but then also what is our data providing some kind of signal? So is what we're looking at as we continue to do these wetlands on 5-year cycles, are there indicators that that might suggest or provide information on the impact to wetlands of climate change? And then certainly each of our sites, we've got national and site-specific data that can inform development of water quality standards, permitting actions, and other things related to wetland regulatory actions. We have data for national databases. So our data and our work with USDA plants to standardize the nomenclature did provide them with information on species occurrence across the entire United States. So can they use that to update their species occurrence maps? National Wetland Inventory, all of our sites were at some point identified as wetlands through, in most cases, aerial imagery analysis and remote analysis. So information that we have on whether a site is wetland or is not wetland might help to inform national mapping projects and programs. We provided information on hydric soils to NRCS, so I know that they've been interested in incorporating some of our data into their hydric soil databases. We're actually working with them this cycle in 2016 to actually expand and augment their soil information for their hydric soil database. And I touched upon this a little bit, but obviously, again, we have information on wetland sites across the country, information on least disturbed, most disturbed, and can this be used in reference site networks of wetlands across the country. And then lastly, just verification and assessment of wetland field indicators. So we went out, we assessed wetlands. We have plant data, soil data, hydrology indicator data. Can we use this to help inform or potentially develop appropriate plant hydrology and hydric soil indicators in areas where those are really problematic? Anyway, that's another thing that we are looking into. And then second to last slide, just in terms of our overall innovations for wetland science, the development of the national indicators of biological condition and stress. I really kind of didn't talk a lot about that on my presentation today, but there's a tremendous amount of work that went into creating the multimetric index of biological condition. And we, our analyst, Teresa McGee, looked at over 500 metrics to develop a VMMI that worked across all of our regions, and we actually did develop one that that worked across each of the different regions and reporting groups. So again, we believe that's a tremendous contribution to wetland science. We also, all of our physical, chemical, and biological indicators of stress are based on readily collected field and lab data collected in one day. There's some effort, and I think all of the field crews can attest to the effort that goes into sampling each site. But relatively speaking, you know, we're assessing these sites during the course of 8 or so hours, and so it is a long field day, but it isn't. We do have indicators now for data that is relatively easy to collect. And then obviously we've got a wealth of data to pursue research into the development of other wetland assessment protocols and indicators. So indicators of stress and health, rapid assessment methods, water chemistry, and algae species. We ultimately did not report on the algae species data in the public report, but we do have data out there, and I know some researchers looking at it to see how that might be applied to telling something about wetland condition and stress. So just real quickly on the 2016 survey, field sampling for NWCA 2016 began April 17th in Georgia. We are collecting data on the same core indicators as 2011, so vegetation, soil, hydrology, water samples, and stressors. I talked already about the expanded design, so greater number of sites in the west. And we also, in adjusting our design to increase the number of sites in the west, we made a number of design changes that actually we believe will increase or improve the distribution of sites across the rest of the country as well. If you look at the map of NWCA 2011 sampled sites, we had very, very few sites in the southern Appalachian Mountains. Kentucky is actually doing an intensification study in 2016, so we'll have over 50 sites in Kentucky, and not all in the southern Appalachian, but we'll certainly have a lot more than we did in 2011. And really across the country, the design is going to result in greater distribution of wetland sites. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop and I'll take some questions.
Okay, thank you very much for presenting the results of the first ever National Wetland Condition Assessment. We are going to have time in a few minutes for questions, but I have a few announcements. First, if your question does not get asked today or you would like to contact our speakers, you can find their contact information on the side. Of course, the nomenclature is the last name, the first name, and at EPA.gov. So please do feel free to contact them. And I do also want to mention that we are currently planning our next webcast and hope that you will visit our website in the coming weeks as we post additional details on the topic, the speakers, and how to register. So please check back with us at www.epa.gov/Watershed Academy. And finally, I also want to ask you to please not forget to download the certificate if you like. This certificate can be downloaded from EPA's server at the URL provided here through the link, the link that's right here. So please type this link into your browser and to download the PDF document. And you can personalize the certificate with the names of everyone who's watching from your location. And finally, when this webcast is over, an evaluation survey will be shown on your computer screen. We encourage you to answer the evaluation and give us feedback, as we always try to listen to the feedback and improve our webcast. And now, with that, we have time for questions, and Annie will lead us through the last question session.
All right. There's been a number of questions kind of about specific stressors, so I think, again, just encourage people to look at the report to get specific data. But there are a few questions about how the stressors are could be tied to specific anthropogenic sources, such as industries, agricultural, residential, and if the data can say anything about how those land uses or activities might be affecting wetlands.
Right. That is a great question, and one that we actually thought of in the process of coming up with the categories for the indicators of stress. And one thought at the start was to tie it to overall categories, so industrial or agriculture or urban, residential. That's actually how our forms were designed. Ultimately, we decided that really the activity itself is tied to, so sort of we wanted to have the stressors really be tied to an activity or action that was leading to the impact on wetland condition. So so we actually shied away from trying to categorize them by industrial stressors or agricultural stressors. There is a way to, if you wanted to look at that within our data sets, because all of our stressors actually are, at least for buffer, are tied to those kinds of categories. And it's certainly something that we could take a look at, but at least for our report, we really wanted to have the activity be closely aligned with the impact and not kind of make essentially value judgments about a particular category of activities having a detrimental impact.
Okay. Do you see any trends in wetland condition across land ownership categories, such as were the good wetlands mostly on public lands or the bad wetlands on one type of land ownership?
That also is a good question. We did not specifically look at the differences between private land or public land, but it's something that we could look at. One thing I'd sort of caution as we get into the sort of issue with having enough sample sites to do that type of analysis. So we might be able to look sort of large scale and nationally at those kind of breakdowns. But so that is a good thought and not something that we did in the report.
Is the data from Alaska being used for any part of the report, or will it be used?
It is not. We do have a highlight from Alaska within the report. Again, the thought is, well, for one, Alaska actually, even though they used a probability-based design to select their sites, it was not tied to the status and trends design that we use. So in terms of the probability nature of both, it would not be easy for us, or we couldn't actually just combine them. And then you also have the issue with really how applicable is the northern coastal plain of Alaska to other ecoregions in the United States. So we left the reporting of data for the Alaska sites to the state, which actually conducted the sampling and the analysis. And I'd encourage you to look at the highlight in the report on Alaska and then follow up with the state of Alaska contacts if you're interested in specific data for Alaska.
Did the sample sites include restoration sites, or is there any way to know if restoration or mitigation programs have made a difference in wetland or surrounding ecosystem health?
We did not have as a specific information piece whether it was the site itself was part of a restoration project or mitigation project. I know that we did have some crews report that some sites were compensatory mitigation sites and some sites were in wetland reserve program or were restorations of some sort. But they were very few. So one, we didn't categorically include or exclude restoration or mitigation sites. If we had information on sort of a national data set on compensatory mitigation sites or restoration sites, we certainly could tie that information to the sites that we sampled and take a look at that. I know in terms of compensatory mitigation, there's a group here at EPA looking at specifically designing a NWCA-like assessment specifically for compensatory mitigation. And if anyone is interested in finding out more about that, certainly feel free to contact me and I can put you in touch with the appropriate people here.
How will some of the data be used? Is it mostly for information, or will EPA or states be taking action on specific wetlands that are in bad shape?
We don't expect that there'd be any specific actions on any one site. Again, the nature of the survey is that, one, we didn't actually assess any one specific wetlands. We really assessed wetland areas. So even for any one site, our results may or may not tell you about that wetlands condition in its entirety. And it's so we don't expect that actually site-specific data will be used in any kind of regulatory or program action. What we really intend this data to do is, as you suggest, inform and be something that people can use as they're thinking about appropriate wetland management and protection strategies, either at the state or local level. And also it's something that we're going to be looking at this data from a national level and seeing how that might inform our national policies and management actions.
Will the 2016 survey include sample sites from 2011 to assess changes over time?
Yes, great question, and something I probably should have mentioned, that yes, 25% of the sites that were selected for sampling in 2016 were sites that were sampled in 2011. So we will have upwards of 200, 250 sites that will have data from both 2011 and 2016, and that is used to assess change.
And this is also kind of related to 2016 and specifically reference sites in the West. Greg, you would be the contact if somebody wanted to be more involved in that, right?
For right now, I would, yes, you can contact me and I will put you in touch with the appropriate folks.
Does the survey look at all at stressors such as subsidence and saltwater intrusion?
So, in terms of saltwater intrusion, that was something that we didn't actually have on an initial list of specific stressors, and we had a lot of crews actually write that in as a stressor in other categories that we allowed them to kind of add and describe. So in 2000, so we did not have a specific, or we didn't ask for salt intrusion in 2011. We know that some crews provided that information to us. So in 2016, we included a category in our stressor checklist for salt intrusion. So that's something that we'll be able to look at from the 2016 data. And subsidence, we might want to look. I mean, I'm assuming that we'd probably be able to look at our soil, the soil characterizations that we do, and have an idea on assessing subsidence directly.
Is there any weight given to hydrologic influences such as stormwater retention areas or subsurface dispersal systems?
We did not specifically look at that, no.
There's also a question if you could go over again how the sites were selected briefly.
Sure. So, and again, I encourage you to check out the technical report. There's actually some good, probably a good overview in the public report as well. But really, there are two ways that we selected sites that were sampled in 2011. And in terms of the probability sites, we used the status and trends sample frame from Fish and Wildlife Service. And what this is they've essentially plotted 5,000 2-mile by 2-mile plots across the country. Each of those plots has been looked at, the aerial imagery for those sites has been looked at, reviewed, and they've essentially outlined all of those 2 mile by 2 mile plots into wetland classification codes based on the coordinate system, and then also upland categories. And so what we did to select sites in 2011 is we took that map, that sample status and trends map from Fish and Wildlife Service, and we used that to as the frame from which we selected random sites. And the random site selection, that I actually can't explain any more than what I just did. It's just through this GRITS process, a computer basically randomly selects sites based on design criteria that you provide, and you may adjust depending on the target population that you're interested in looking at. And again, any more specific information on that, I really encourage you to look at the technical report. So that's how we selected the probability-based sites. In terms of the hand-picked candidate sites that we hoped would be referenced and would augment our pool of least disturbed sites, those came from a number of sources. We asked for recommendations from states, federal agencies that had that managed land that had potentially reference wetlands on them. We had and sampled some sites from previous research work undertaken by the Environmental Monitoring and Assessment Program by ORD that had identified reference sites. And so, so basically we used a number of different ways to get recommendations for those hand-picked sites. Then those went through a screen where we screened them based on disturbances that we could see in aerial imagery, and we selected about 100 of those sites. So all told, we sampled about 1,000 probability sites that, again, were sampled using the status and trends wetland maps as our selection frame map, and then a computer basically statistically and randomly selected the 1,000 probability sites, and then the hand-picked sites were, we selected about 100, 150 of those I think ultimately were sampled.
All right. Did you look at hydrological alterations caused by groundwater table reduction?
Not specifically, but we collected a lot of different data, so there's a way we may actually be able to look at that specifically. I mean, well, we did look at ditching, so I think we probably have data that you could use to get at that, but
yeah. I think that's most of the questions. And some of the specific questions I think we'll want to contact people individually to discuss. They're more involved.
All right.
Okay, that's it. Any closing remarks?
Oh, the last question is, what specific actions might result from your work?
We have no specific actions just yet. We are still evaluating them. How's that for a program answer?
Okay, well, thank you, Greg. I think a lot of things have resulted from your great work, so I just want to echo that. And certainly you're getting a chance to do it again, starting again this season with the field season, and make some enhancements with more sites and so forth in the West, and learn from the experiences of the last survey. So at this time, I want to conclude today's webcast and thank all of you for joining us, and to thank our amazing speakers. And that ends our webcast for today. Thank you again for joining us.